I've always enjoyed the solitude of the wilderness. Something about the silence, the absence of city noise, makes me feel alive in a way that no crowded bar or bustling street ever could. The crisp air of the mountains, the scent of pine trees, and the distant sound of running water, those were the things I craved. I wasn't new to hiking or camping. I had spent years exploring the woods of the Pacific Northwest, and after hearing about a remote spot in Northern California, I decided to check it out. This place wasn't your typical tourist trail. You wouldn't find the usual crowds of backpackers or families with kids. It was far enough out of the way to feel almost untouched, a place where you could truly get away from everything. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to break over the horizon. The forest was still dark, but there was a quiet warmth to the light creeping through the trees. I wasn't in a rush. I never was. With my backpack secured and my gear in good shape, I set off into the woods, following the narrow trail that wound through the thick underbrush. I spent the day hiking, taking my time, enjoying the beauty around me. The deeper I went into the forest, the more at peace I felt. There was something magical about being so far from civilization. It wasn't about escape for me. It was about reconnecting. I wanted nothing more than the sound of my boots crunching on the trail and the occasional bird call to remind me I was alive. By late afternoon, I found a spot near a small stream. The water was clear, and the surrounding trees offered enough shelter to make a comfortable camp. It wasn't the most scenic place I'd ever set up, but it was quiet, and that was all that mattered. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up my camp. I even had a small campfire going by the time the sun started setting. As the evening wore on, the air grew cooler, and the forest seemed to settle into the rhythm of the night. That was when I noticed the other camper. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, but I must have missed him earlier when I was focused on setting up my camp. He appeared from behind a cluster of trees, moving slowly and quietly, like he was trying not to disturb the peace of the place. His face was weathered, with a few days of stubble and deep-set eyes that made him look older than he probably was. His clothes were worn but functional, and his pack was massive, the kind of pack that suggested he had been on the trail for a while. He didn't say much at first. We exchanged nods, and I offered him a seat by the fire. He accepted, and for a while we just sat in silence, watching the flames dance. I wasn't much for small talk, and he didn't seem to be either. But after a while he spoke. "Quiet out here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, taking a sip from my canteen. "That's the idea. It's why I come out here, to get away from everything." He gave me a faint smile but didn't respond. We both sat there, the fire crackling between us. After a moment, I noticed him staring into the flames, lost in thought. I didn't want to press him, but curiosity got the better of me. "What brings you out here?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just needed some space. Thought I'd get away for a while." I could tell he wasn't interested in sharing too much, and I wasn't about to pry. We spent the rest of the evening in comfortable silence, the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig the only sounds in the otherwise still night. When the fire died down, we both retreated to our tents, each of us left alone with our thoughts. The next morning, I woke early, the light of dawn filtering through the trees. My breath hung in the crisp morning air as I stretched and got ready to pack up camp. It was when I stepped out of my tent that I realized something was wrong. David, at least that's what he had told me his name was gone. His tent was still there, collapsed as though he had just crawled out of it, but there was no sign of him anywhere. No pack, no gear, nothing. I looked around the campsite, but everything was as it had been the night before, except for the absence of the other camper. It didn't make sense. I called out his name a few times, but the forest remained silent. I even walked around the edge of the camp, checking for footprints or signs that he had just wandered off. There was nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My stomach twisted. I wasn't worried at first. Maybe he had left early, wanting to get a head start on the trail. But as the minutes passed, that nagging feeling of unease crept in. I knew something was off. David had been an odd guy, sure, but he was no different from the other solo campers I had met. I didn't expect him to just disappear. I packed up my camp, deciding I'd head in the same direction I had planned to go. But the further I walked, the more paranoid I became. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I kept thinking I'd catch sight of David up ahead, or hear him calling from somewhere behind me, but there was nothing. The more I walked, the deeper into the woods I seemed to go. Every time I looked around, I saw the same trees, the same rocks, the same stretch of trail I had passed earlier. It was like I was walking in circles. The familiar landmarks had started to blur together, and the woods felt wrong. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was an experienced hiker, used to navigating through difficult terrain. I shouldn't be getting this paranoid. Yet, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I kept hearing things behind me. Footsteps, the snap of a twig. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. The trail I had been following had started to fade. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path carved through the underbrush, and now it was getting harder to follow. I thought back to the campsite, the spot where David's tent had been. Why hadn't he left anything behind? No sign of him, no note, nothing at all. I pushed on, hoping I was just overthinking things, but the deeper I got into the forest, the less certain I became. I began to wonder if I had missed a turn, if I had strayed off the path. It felt like the forest was closing in around me, and the more I searched for signs of David, the more I began to doubt my own sense of direction. Hours passed, and I still hadn't found anything. There was no trace of David, no trace of anything familiar. I was lost at my hands shook as I reached for my map, only to find that it had slipped from my pocket somewhere along the way. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail I thought I had been following had disappeared, and the woods around me seemed unfamiliar. The trees looked different, the shadows darker. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path seemed to shift, like the forest itself was playing tricks on me. The paranoia I had felt earlier grew, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was being followed. My breath came in short bursts, my head spinning. I wanted to scream, but I didn't dare. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set, I stumbled upon something. It was a small clearing, one I didn't recognize, but there, in the center, was something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks, arranged in a circle. The fire pit was cold, the ashes long dead, and standing there at the edge of the clearing was a figure, David. But something was wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like he was waiting for something. That I froze, staring at him. My legs felt like they were made of stone. My heart pounded, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot. David didn't turn to face me. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at the ground. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned as though they were alive, the sound echoing through the silence. Then, with a sudden jolt, I snapped out of my trance. I turned and ran, not looking back, not caring where the path led anymore. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I eventually made my way back to the trailhead, disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive. The forest had swallowed my sense of reality for hours, playing tricks on me, but I was out now. And yet, as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I never found David again. I'm Emma, a 28-year-old hiker from upstate New York. I've always loved being out in nature, especially the Adirondacks. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the feeling of being far from civilization, that calls to me. After a few years of short-day hikes and weekends spent camping, I decided it was time for a bigger challenge. A solo backpacking trip through some of the more remote parts of the Adirondack Mountains. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and get a little peace and solitude in the process. I planned carefully. I'd been hiking for years, so I was confident in my skills. I knew how to read a map, use a compass, and I was well prepared with the right gear. The weather forecast had predicted mild conditions for the first few days, with a cold front moving in on day 3, so I made sure I was ready for whatever the mountains might throw at me. I'd packed light, but with enough to stay comfortable and safe. A tent, sleeping bag, food for the trip, and of course my phone, though I didn't plan on needing it much. I started my hike at sunrise, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the excitement of the trail beneath my boots. The first day was beautiful. The sky was clear, and the trails were well marked. I passed a few other hikers along the way, but mostly I was alone, just how I liked it. The woods felt alive, and I reveled in the sense of freedom. But by the second day, things took a turn. I had planned to stay on one of the more remote trails that looped through an area with fewer hikers. It was a part of the park I hadn't explored before, and I was excited to see something new. The trail markers became less frequent, and the path started to narrow. Still, I felt confident. This was part of the challenge, after all. That was when I made my mistake. I missed a turn. The signpost was small, barely noticeable, and I was too caught up in the beauty around me to pay close attention. I kept walking, thinking I was following the right path. It wasn't until I looked around and realized the surroundings were unfamiliar that I started to panic. The trees seemed thicker, the trail less distinct. I stopped and checked my map, then my compass. I knew something was wrong. My phone was dead, and I had left my charger at the bottom of my pack. I planned to conserve battery, so I hadn't bothered charging it that morning. Stupid mistake, I thought. I'd always been careful, always prepared. But now I was truly alone. The sky had been cloudy all day, and as the hours passed, the clouds thickened. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, bringing with it the first hints of rain. I could feel the temperature dropping, too. I had a jacket, but the cold wasn't what worried me. It was the growing uncertainty. Where was the trail? Had I gone off it entirely? How could I have been so careless? I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest felt endless. The trees stretched high above me, blocking out what little light there was. I could hear the rustling of the wind through the branches, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots, and my own breathing, quick, shallow. My heart raced. As the night drew closer, I knew I had to make camp. I found a small clearing and set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking from the cold and stress. I told myself that I'd figure it out in the morning. I just had to sleep and rest. But deep down, I knew I wasn't as prepared for this as I'd thought. The night was cold. The wind howled outside the tent, and the rain started to fall harder. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the forest around me. It was the kind of silence that could drive a person mad if they weren't used to it. And I wasn't used to it, not like this. My mind kept drifting back to the trail, to the mistake I'd made, and to the growing sense of unease. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I was jolted awake by the sound of something. Someone moving outside my tent. I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else, but it was enough to keep me alert. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the trail and find my way out of this mess. I could still hear the rain falling, but the sky had lightened a little. I tried to follow the direction I thought I'd come from, but nothing seemed right. Every turn led me deeper into unfamiliar woods. The more I tried to find my way, the more I felt like I was going in circles. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, too fresh. I squatted down to examine them, my heart pounding. They weren't big, but they were clear. A pair of boots, larger than mine, leading away from where I'd camped. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail before, and now this, a sense of dread washed over me. I tried to shake it off. Could have been anyone. Maybe another hiker, someone who got off the trail too. But the more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I hadn't heard anyone pass during the night, and I hadn't seen anyone yesterday. Who could it have been? I continued walking, more cautious now, but the sense of being watched never left. The sounds of the forest were all around me. Birds, the wind, the rain. But I kept hearing something else. Soft footsteps behind me, just on the edge of my hearing. When I turned to look, there was nothing, but my gut told me something was wrong. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The weather hadn't improved, and I hadn't found the trail or any familiar markers. As I set up camp for the night, I felt like the forest was closing in on me. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy. I hadn't seen a single person all day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. I checked my tent, my gear, everything. My map was where I left it. My food was still in my pack. But then I noticed something strange. My water bottle, which had been right next to me when I set up camp, was now several feet away. My first thought was that I had moved it by accident, but when I checked my footsteps, I saw no sign that I had gone near it. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I found more signs, small things, but they made my blood run cold. A branch that had been in my path the day before was moved, now twisted in a way that didn't make sense. Another set of footprints, this time deeper, closer. Someone had been following me. I knew it. The worst part was that it wasn't just the footprints or the missing items. It was the way the forest seemed to change. The path I'd been walking was getting more and more difficult. Small, subtle changes. Rocks in the way, branches leaning toward me as though trying to guide me in the wrong direction. I tried to call out, hoping for a response, but there was nothing. No one was here, or if they were, they weren't responding. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I realized something. Whoever was doing this wasn't just following me. They were trying to make sure I couldn't leave. I wasn't just lost. I was being trapped. It was late September when Sarah and I decided to take a week-long hike along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail. We'd been talking about it for months, both craving the peace and quiet that only a remote trail could provide. There were fewer people out there, fewer distractions. It was exactly what we needed, just the two of us, the woods, and our thoughts. At least that's what we'd hoped. We parked at the trailhead just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The air was already cooling, and the scent of pine filled the air. It was beautiful, and I felt the weight of the city life slowly lift off my shoulders as we started our hike. The first couple of days were everything we'd expected. Crisp mornings, long days spent hiking through dense forests, and nights around a fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the sounds of the woods. The trail was well marked, and we saw a few other hikers here and there, but nothing too crowded. We were truly out in nature. On the third day, things started to feel different. We were following the main trail when Sarah, always the more adventurous one, noticed an overgrown path that veered off to the side. It wasn't on our map, but it had that familiar, inviting pull that you sometimes get when you're far from civilization. "Let's check it out," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I was feeling restless too. The idea of exploring somewhere new, somewhere untouched, was hard to resist. We followed the narrow trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The path was rougher, with tall grass and bushes brushing against our legs. The further we went, the more the sounds of the forest around us seemed to fade, replaced by a strange quietness. Even the birds had stopped calling. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a clearing, and there it was, an old cabin. It sat alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a thick wall of trees. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. Stood there for a moment, unsure whether to go closer. The place had an eerie feel to it, something off, but it also had a strange pull. I've always believed that abandoned places held stories, and this one was no different. We approached the cabin cautiously. The air felt heavier here, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. As we stepped inside, the floor creaked under our weight, the dust thick in the air. The room was a mess. Furniture overturned, scattered belongings, a few empty cans on the ground. An old lantern sat in the corner, knocked over with oil still pooled around it. It was as if someone had been here, left in a rush, but for what reason? I walked further into the cabin, and my boots scraped against something sharp. Looking down, I saw broken glass, shards from a smashed picture frame. The photo was gone, but the frame itself was still there, cracked and abandoned like everything else. "This place is creepy," Sarah whispered, standing at the door and scanning the area outside. "We should probably leave." But I wasn't ready to leave yet. My curiosity had taken over, and I needed to know more. I moved through the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the dust and debris. Something about the place seemed wrong. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. The way everything was left in such a chaotic state, it didn't sit right. I turned to Sarah. "Maybe we should check outside, see if there's anything else." She nodded, reluctantly, and we stepped back out onto the porch. The air was colder now, the wind picking up, making the trees around us sway. That's when I saw it, a movement in the distance. A figure, barely visible between the trees, just standing there watching us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah followed my gaze, but by the time she looked, the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. She nodded, her expression tense. "Who the hell would be out here?" I felt a chill run through me. It didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from the nearest trail, and the path we'd taken was barely noticeable. Who would be out here? "We should go," Sarah said, and I agreed. The tension between us was palpable, and the sense that something wasn't right grew stronger with every second. We started back down the overgrown path, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But as we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, more oppressive, the shadows deeper, the wind carrying a low, unsettling hum. We hadn't made it far when we heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from behind us. Someone was following us. I grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to move. Now." We started running, our breath coming in short bursts, our feet pounding the earth beneath us. The trail was harder to follow now, the brush thicker, and it felt as though the trees were closing in on us. Every so often, I heard something behind us, a snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. By the time we reached the main trail, we were out of breath, our faces pale. But the footsteps hadn't stopped. Whoever was out there had followed us, and they were still close. We didn't stop. We didn't even look back. We just kept running until we reached the point where the main trail met a wider, more traveled path. There, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. For a long time, we sat there, not speaking, just listening. The only sound was the wind through the trees. No footsteps, no movement. But I knew, deep down, that whoever had been following us wasn't far behind. The rest of the hike was a blur. We didn't take any detours, didn't stop to enjoy the views. We just kept moving, the dread from that cabin still heavy in the air. By the time we made it to the next campsite, we were both exhausted mentally and physically. It wasn't until we were safely back home, far away from the trail, that we could talk about what happened. We never found out who had been following us, or why that cabin had been left so hastily. All we knew was that there was someone out there, someone who didn't want us to know what they were hiding. And as much as we wanted to forget about it, I knew we never would. Because some places aren't meant to be discovered. Some trails lead to more than just physical destinations. They lead to things that should stay buried. It was the weekend before finals, and I was on the edge. The last few weeks had been a blur of exams, papers, and endless cups of coffee. I had barely seen my best friend Hannah, and when I suggested we escape for a weekend camping trip to the Sierra Nevada mountains, she didn't need much convincing. She'd been just as stressed as I was. We were both 22, college seniors at the University of California, and we'd been friends since our first year. I had always been the more outdoorsy one, spending my summers hiking in the Adirondacks, camping in remote spots, and Hannah, well, she liked the idea of nature but didn't always enjoy the reality of it. But this time, she was on board. She packed her bags with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, both relieved and nervous at the thought of a break from everything. Plan was simple. Drive up to the mountains on Friday, hike on Saturday, and relax around the campfire at night. We'd be back by Sunday evening, ready to face finals head-on. No cell service, no distractions. Just the two of us and the wild. We left early Friday morning, making our way from our apartment in Reno, Nevada, into the mountains. The drive was smooth, with the sky clear and the temperature pleasant. The road wound through tall trees, open meadows, and rocky outcrops as we made our way toward a quiet campground in a remote part of the Sierra Nevada. It was the kind of place where you felt like you could disappear, which was exactly what we needed. By midday, we had set up our tent by a small creek. The air was fresh and cool, and the world seemed peaceful. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the surrounding woods and hiking to a nearby viewpoint. We could see for miles, a breathtaking expanse of forests, snow-capped peaks, and the valleys below. We joked about how easy it was to forget everything when you were surrounded by such beauty. It felt like the perfect escape. As night fell, we built a small fire by our campsite, roasting marshmallows and talking about everything we'd been too busy to discuss in the past few months. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. The fire crackled, and the dark sky above was lit with stars. There was something magical about being so far from the world, just two college girls in the wilderness, trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our lives. But as the night deepened, I began to feel something strange. The woods around us, which had felt inviting earlier in the day, seemed a little too quiet. The usual sounds of nature were muted, almost like everything was holding its breath. I didn't mention it to Hannah, not wanting to ruin the mood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We turned in early that night, the cold air nipping at our faces as we zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags. The tent was small but cozy, and we fell asleep quickly, tired from the day's activities. The next morning, we woke up to clear skies and a chill in the air. We were eager to start our hike, so we packed our backpacks with water, snacks, and the essentials. I made sure to grab the compass and GPS I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, especially in a place this remote. The plan was to follow a trail that led deeper into the mountains. According to the map, it would take us to an isolated lake where we could relax and have lunch before heading back. The hike was supposed to take about 5 hours, so we didn't want to waste any time. We set off around 9 a.m., following the trail as it wound through the trees. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. For the first couple of hours, everything went smoothly. We were laughing, taking pictures, and enjoying the natural beauty around us. But then, things started to get weird. I had been relying on my compass and GPS to keep track of our location, but suddenly, the compass needle began to spin wildly. I stopped and checked the GPS, but the screen was blank. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction. Maybe the batteries were low or the signal was lost. I tried resetting the GPS, but it didn't work. The compass was still useless, and the map didn't seem to match what I was seeing around us. Maybe we've gone off the trail a bit, I said, trying to stay calm. Let's just backtrack and see if we can find a landmark. Hannah agreed, and we retraced our steps for a while. But the more we walked, the more it felt like we were moving in circles. The trail markers, which had been easy to follow at first, seemed to be disappearing. We couldn't find any signs or familiar landmarks. The woods had begun to look different, darker, more enclosed. The trees were taller, and the trail seemed to narrow and twist in unexpected directions. We tried to use the map to get our bearings, but it didn't make sense. The map didn't match the terrain around us. I began to feel a creeping unease in my stomach, and I could tell Hannah was starting to get nervous too. We weren't lost, I told myself. It had to be a glitch, a simple mistake. But as we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, and the sun, once bright, was now obscured by thick clouds. The trail had vanished completely, and we were just wandering through the woods, hoping for a sign of direction. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the temperature dropped even further. My thoughts began to race. What if we couldn't find our way back? What if we were truly lost? The peaceful wilderness I had loved so much just the day before now felt hostile, like it was trapping us. By the time the sun had set, we had no choice but to stop. We found a small clearing near a stream and set up camp as best we could. My hands were shaking as I tried to start a fire, and I could tell Hannah was just as scared. We huddled together by the fire, the shadows of the trees surrounding us like silent watchers. I don't know what's going on, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Something's wrong. The map, the compass. It's like the woods are shifting. Hannah didn't say anything at first, but then she spoke, her voice filled with uncertainty. Mia, I think we're being kept here. Someone's messing with us. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the forest was working against us. It wasn't just bad luck or malfunctioning equipment. Someone had been watching us, leading us deeper into the wilderness, keeping us from escaping. We stayed up all night, keeping the fire burning as best we could. Every snap of a twig in the dark made our hearts race, and every gust of wind through the trees felt like an ominous warning. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, we woke up to a strange silence. The wind had stopped, and the world felt unnaturally still. We gathered our things quickly, desperate to find our way back. But when we stepped out of the clearing, the woods seemed completely different. There were no familiar paths, no landmarks to guide us. We were further off the trail than ever before. We kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but the more we walked, the more we realized we were hopelessly lost. The trees closed in, the shadows deepened, and the landscape became increasingly unfamiliar. Every direction seemed the same. It wasn't until the late afternoon that we stumbled across something we hadn't expected. A small old cabin, half hidden in the trees. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It wasn't on the map, and it didn't belong here. But it was shelter, and that's all we needed. We took refuge in the cabin, barricading the door with whatever we could find. As night fell again, I knew that whatever had been keeping us here, whatever had been leading us deeper into the wilderness, was still out there watching. But for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely helpless. We didn't have a clear way out, but we were safe for now. The next morning, we made our way back to the trailhead, determined to get to civilization. The woods seemed to relent, and after what felt like an eternity, we finally found our way out. We stumbled back to our car, exhausted and shaken but alive. As we drove away, the weight of the wilderness finally lifted. We never figured out what happened that weekend. There was no one in the cabin. No one ever came forward to explain the strange things we encountered. But when I looked back at that weekend, I knew one thing for sure. The wilderness wasn't something to take lightly, and sometimes it has a way of holding you exactly where it wants you. We never went back to the Sierra Nevada. The sun had barely started to break over the horizon when we set up camp, the last stretch of our drive now behind us. The cool air of the Rocky Mountains kissed my skin, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. I had to admit, there was something calming about being here. The wilderness felt like the right place to reconnect with my son, Jake, after spending so many years away in the military. It had been a long, tough deployment, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. This trip was meant to fix that. Jake was 16 now, almost a man, but still young enough to want adventure. I'd seen it in his eyes when he'd agreed to this trip. We both needed this time, but for different reasons. For me, it was a way to unwind, to breathe a little easier after years of constant vigilance. For him, I think it was about testing himself, proving something, whether to me or to himself, I wasn't sure. Our first night in the cabin was quiet, the kind of silence that only the wilderness can provide. We'd set up camp by a clear stream, nestled among the trees. It was perfect, peaceful. I tried not to think about the strange feeling in my chest, the sense of being watched, but it lingered. The morning came fast. I woke up before the sun, a habit I couldn't break, and stretched out in the tent. My body was sore from the drive, but it felt good to be out here, away from the hustle of the world. I stepped out into the cold, looking around. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were huge, much larger than any animal track I recognized, and they circled our tent, the edges still fresh with dew. Jake had woken up too and saw them. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe it was a bear or something else, I thought. The mountain wildlife was unpredictable, but the footprints weren't right. Bears don't walk in a perfect circle around your camp. Still, I told Jake not to worry about it, to just keep an eye out. We spent the day hiking, and the further we went, the more unsettled I felt. The woods here weren't like the ones back home in Vermont. They felt older, denser, as though they had seen more than their share of history. By the time we got back to the camp, the strange footprints were gone, and I figured it was nothing. That night, as we settled into the cabin again, the unease crept back. I checked the perimeter of the camp, no sign of anything unusual. But when I went back inside, Jake was already sitting by the fire, staring out into the darkness. "Something's off, Dad," he said quietly, almost as though he were talking to himself. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to scare him, but I felt it too. Something wasn't right here. We spent the evening in silence, the crackling fire our only company. The second night, we heard something. At first, I thought it was a bear rummaging through our supplies, but when I checked the area around the tent, nothing was touched. That's when it hit me. Someone was out there. Someone was watching us. I tried to stay calm. Could have been a hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But I knew in my gut that it wasn't. My years in the military taught me to trust my instincts, and something about the way the woods were quiet, unnervingly quiet, told me we weren't alone. The next morning, I decided to go further up the trail, away from camp. I needed to clear my head. Jake stayed behind, and I told him to keep the fire going and stay inside the cabin. But when I came back, I found something that stopped me cold. A torn piece of military gear, a patch that I recognized. It wasn't new, but it was unmistakable. It was from a squad I had served with, men who had vanished under strange circumstances years ago. I had never told Jake about that. He didn't know. He didn't need to. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I held the patch in my hands. There was no way this could be a coincidence. The thought that someone might be out here watching us wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a certainty. Jake came out of the cabin, his face pale. He didn't say anything at first, but when he saw the patch, his eyes widened. "Dad, what's going on?" "I don't know yet, Jake," I replied, my voice tight. "But we need to get out of here. Now." We packed up quickly, gathering what little gear we had left. I kept scanning the trees, feeling the weight of eyes on us from every direction. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the evidence was piling up. The strange footprints, the missing food, the patch. Something wasn't right, and I was damn sure it wasn't just some animal. As we started down the trail, the woods behind us felt alive, watching us, waiting. It was a quiet pursuit, but it was a pursuit nonetheless. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf had me on edge. I didn't know if we were being followed or if it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I wasn't about to take any chances. By the time we reached the car, I was convinced. Whoever or whatever had been out, there was no coincidence. I had survived too many close calls in my life to ignore that feeling of being hunted. And that patch, the one from the squad that had disappeared, was the final nail in the coffin. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Jake seemed shaken, and honestly, I was too. We'd been out in the wild long enough to know how quickly things could go wrong. But this felt different. This wasn't just a bad situation. It was a warning. That night, as we crossed the state line back into a more populated area, I felt the weight lift off my chest. The forest was behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't fully escaped. Whoever had been out there was still out there, somewhere in those woods, and they weren't going to forget about us. But we didn't look back. We just kept driving. I wanted this trip to be special, something different, something that would challenge Charlie, that would give him an experience he wouldn't forget. But I didn't plan for it to go like this. It was a cool, crisp fall weekend when I decided to take my 12-year-old son, Charlie, on a camping trip deep in the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. We'd been on plenty of trips before, but this one would be different. Far from any marked trail, far from the usual spots where people camp, and far from anything resembling the comfort of a campground. I thought it would be a great way to teach Charlie some skills, to make him feel the weight of true wilderness. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The woods were dense, the trees towering and thick, the smell of pine sharp in the air. We hiked along the narrow trails, climbed over rocks, and built a fire at our campsite. The sun set low, and the forest took on that eerie quiet, where every sound seems amplified. Charlie and I sat around the fire, talking about nothing and everything, like we always did. He was excited but a little scared, which I liked. It meant he was paying attention. I wanted him to respect nature, to understand it wasn't something to take lightly. But that night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as the fire dwindled and the darkness took over, I had this nagging sense that we weren't as alone as we should have been. Maybe it was the wind, how it seemed to howl through the trees, or the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the usual forest sounds. Charlie fell asleep in the tent next to me, and I lay there, staring out through the small opening, listening. Eventually, sleep took me, but it wasn't long before I was awake again, heart racing. I don't know why I woke up, but something pulled me out of the haze of sleep. Maybe it was a noise. Maybe it was the dark that had crept in too deep. Whatever it was, I felt a shift in the air, a change I couldn't ignore. It was the second morning when things started to go wrong. Charlie and I packed up our gear after breakfast and decided to head deeper into the forest. There were no clear paths from here. Just us and the wild, no maps, no directions, just the trees and the rough terrain. I told Charlie to stick close, and he listened mostly. We were only a couple of hours in when I noticed he wasn't by my side anymore. I turned around, calling his name, but no answer. I called again, louder this time. Charlie! Nothing. Panic crept up my spine. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I turned in circles, scanning the trees, the rocks, the trail. The woods had swallowed him up in an instant. I started walking, my heart pounding in my chest. Charlie! I shouted again, pushing through the dense underbrush. There were no answers, just the wind and the creaking of the trees. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, tightening around me. For what felt like hours, I retraced our steps, calling out, my voice hoarse and desperate. I tried to remember where he might have gone, where he could have wandered off to, but nothing made sense. He wasn't anywhere. I wasn't the type of person to panic, not normally, but this was different. This wasn't just getting lost in the woods. This felt like something had changed, like something was wrong. I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I pushed deeper into the woods, my eyes darting between the trees, the feeling that I wasn't alone growing stronger by the minute. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me stop, freeze, listen. Was it him? Was it something else? And then, near a small riverbank, I saw something. A piece of clothing, torn, covered in dirt, and something red. My stomach lurched. I reached down, picking it up carefully. It was Charlie's jacket. The sleeve was torn, and there were small splashes of blood on the fabric. My heart stopped. I felt my hands tremble as I held the jacket, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a little scrape. This was serious. I shouted his name again, my voice breaking this time, but still no answer. Only the sound of the wind, louder now, as if the forest itself was mocking me. I knew at that moment I was in over my head. This wasn't some simple search for a lost kid. There was something else going on, something I couldn't explain. I started moving faster, more frantic, my mind racing with possibilities. But every step I took seemed to push me further into the heart of the woods. The further I went, the more I felt the tension building in my chest, the more my instincts screamed that I was being led somewhere. I pushed through the thick brush, the sound of the river louder now, almost deafening. I had to get to the other side. Maybe he'd crossed it. Maybe he was just disoriented. I could almost hear him, the faintest echo of his voice in my head. As I moved along the riverbank, I noticed something else. A trap, a snare set high in a tree. I stopped, staring at it, confused. Who would set a trap in the middle of the woods like this? It was too well hidden, too carefully placed. I felt my throat tighten. I wasn't just searching for Charlie anymore. I was looking for something or someone that didn't want me to find him. I turned back, my mind racing. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, and the forest was growing darker, colder. It wasn't just the light fading. It was something else. It felt like something was stalking me now, watching my every move. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig sent me into a panic. And then I found it. Another piece of Charlie's clothing. This time it was a shoe, but it wasn't just abandoned. It was ripped, shredded, like something had torn it off. I dropped to my knees, heart hammering, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What was happening to him? Who or what was out here with us? I spent the next few hours searching, getting more and more desperate as I walked deeper into the forest. Couldn't give up. I wouldn't. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I was walking into something far darker than I could have imagined. And then I found it. At the edge of a clearing, I stumbled into a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked old, abandoned. The windows were shattered, the door half hanging off its hinges. There were signs of recent activity, though. I could see footprints leading in and out of the cabin, and there was something else. Something darker. I felt my heart rate spike. This wasn't just a place to hide from the elements. It was a trap. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not without Charlie. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing me whole. I stepped in, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I froze. There, in the corner, was Charlie. He was tied up, gagged, and unconscious, his body bruised and battered. My heart sank into my stomach. I rushed over, tearing at the ropes holding him, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I freed him, I heard a noise behind me, a footstep. I spun around, but there was nothing, no one, only the empty cabin, the broken windows, and the oppressive silence of the forest outside. I didn't wait. I picked Charlie up, ignoring the pain in my legs and back as I carried him out of the cabin. Something had been waiting for us, and now that it had what it wanted, I wasn't about to stick around and find out what else it had in store. We made it back to the campsite that night, both of us shaken, both of us changed. I didn't know what had happened out there or who or what had been behind it all, but I didn't care. All that mattered was that Charlie was safe, and that whatever that thing was, it was still out there in the dark, waiting. I told myself I'd never take him so far off the trail again. There was no adventure worth risking your life or your child's for. The woods had claimed its price that day, but I wasn't going to let it take any more. Not ever again. It's hard to believe how things got out of control so quickly. My friends and I had been camping for years. We'd been everywhere from the Adirondacks to the Rocky Mountains, but this time was different. We chose a spot in the Cascade Range, way off the beaten path. The place was remote, isolated, and even our GPS couldn't pick up a clear signal there. It sounded perfect. There was me, Ryan, 28, the one who usually took charge of setting up camp. Mark, 29, a more laid-back guy who always found a way to keep things light. And Sarah, 27, the one who had a sixth sense when it came to safety. We all knew the wilderness well, but something about this place had a feeling to it. I don't think any of us could put it into words at first, but as the day wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The weather was clear when we arrived, the sun shining down, with a soft breeze rustling the trees. The campsite was perfect, nestled between tall, old pines and a crystal-clear creek. We had all the usual camping gear with us: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, plus a few extras. I set up the tents while Mark started a fire and Sarah gathered some firewood. Everything felt like any other trip, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, there was something about the silence that didn't sit right with me. That night, as we sat by the fire, the forest around us seemed to close in. The sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves were the only things we could hear. No birds, no distant animal calls, just the eerie quiet. Mark laughed it off, making jokes about how we were getting soft. Sarah, however, wasn't laughing. She kept glancing into the trees as if something was lurking there, just out of sight. We all retired to our tents after a while. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows dancing on the canvas walls of the tent. The fire had long since burned out, and the darkness outside was complete. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and steady, crunching through the dry leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something common. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone was walking around our camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps circled our camp, moving slowly, carefully, almost like someone was trying not to make a sound, but failing. It wasn't like any animal I knew. I nudged Mark, who was sleeping beside me, but he didn't stir. I crept out of my bag, careful not to make a sound, and unzipped the tent just a crack. I couldn't see anything in the pitch-black night, but I could hear the footsteps now moving closer to our tents. I wanted to call out, but something held me back. If it was someone trying to sneak up on us, I didn't want to make them aware that we knew. So I waited, holding my breath, listening as the steps drew nearer. Then nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence returned. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake for hours, my heart racing, my mind running wild with possibilities. Could it have been another camper, a ranger, or something else? Morning came slowly, and when the first light of day filtered through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark and Sarah were already awake, and they didn't mention anything about the footsteps. It wasn't until we started gathering our things for breakfast that I noticed the first sign of something wrong. Our food supplies, cans of beans, packages of jerky, the bread we'd brought, had been tampered with. Some of it was missing, and the rest was scattered around like someone had rifled through it. But there was something else. Footprints. Not animal tracks, but human-sized prints, barefoot and deep, like someone had been walking around our camp during the night. First, we tried to shrug it off. Maybe another camper was hungry, and we just hadn't seen them. But then, when we looked at the tracks, something about them didn't sit right. They circled the campsite, moving from one end to the other, like whoever it was had been observing us. I felt a chill run down my spine. No one else was supposed to be out here. We were miles from the nearest trail, and we hadn't seen anyone on our way in. Maybe it's just a prank, Mark said, trying to keep things light. I mean, this is Yellowstone. People do weird things out here. I wasn't convinced. Something felt wrong, and it had nothing to do with a prank.
I glänst over at Sara.
Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and she was staring at the forest, like she was waiting for something to move. Let's just pack up and head back to the car, Sarah said, her voice tight. I don't care if we were planning to stay another night. Something's off. I didn't argue with her. I agreed we should leave, but as we packed our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch underfoot made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight. As we started to break down camp, we noticed something even stranger. The tracks weren't just around the food. They led deeper into the forest, away from the camp. Whoever had been watching us hadn't just been observing. They were going somewhere, and they hadn't left in a hurry. The tracks were careful, slow, as if the person had been making sure they weren't seen. We decided to follow the tracks. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe we should have just gotten in the car and left, but curiosity got the better of us. We spent the next few hours hiking through the forest, following the strange prints. It wasn't until midday that we came across something that made our blood run cold. A small, abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the woods. The place looked ancient, like it hadn't been used in decades, but the door was slightly ajar, and there was something unsettling about it. Mark and Sarah were hesitant, but I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the forest. Inside, there was nothing but dust and decay. Old furniture, broken windows, and cobwebs everywhere. But as I stepped further into the room, I noticed something odd. A series of marks on the walls, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Suddenly, we heard a noise. A scraping sound coming from the far side of the cabin. We froze, staring into the darkness. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure stepped out. Not a person, but something far worse. Skinny, wild-eyed, with unkempt hair and clothes torn from years of living in the woods. The smell hit us first, a combination of decay, sweat, and something worse. It was a man, or at least he used to be. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. The way he moved, it was clear he was just as scared as we were, if not more. He backed away from us, eyes wide, muttering something under his breath, but we couldn't understand him. His language was strange, guttural. He was the one who had been watching us. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." We didn't wait to ask questions. We turned and ran out of the cabin, not looking back. The whole way back to the car, I kept thinking about the strange man. Had he been living in the woods all this time? Was he the one who had been following us? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. When we finally reached the car and started the engine, it was like a weight lifted off our shoulders. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching us as we drove away, as if the eyes from the woods were still on us, even from miles away. And maybe they always would be. The last leg of our trip was dragging on. We'd been on the road for days, hauling freight across the country. Doug and I, two old truckers, were used to the grind, but by the time we hit the Rocky Mountains, we were both itching for a break. We needed to stretch our legs, take a breather, and maybe get some sleep without the constant hum of the engine in the background. So we decided to pull off the highway and find a place to camp, far away from the noise of the trucks, the cars, and the gas stations. It was late afternoon when we found a spot, the kind of place you couldn't just stumble upon by accident. Secluded, tucked away behind a bend in the road, with nothing but trees and rugged terrain around. No one would bother us here. It felt peaceful, almost like we were the only two people left in the world. We parked the truck at the edge of the dirt road, and after a quick stretch, we got to work setting up camp. Doug and I were both familiar with the outdoors, though we didn't do much camping when we were on the job. That didn't stop us from having a good time. I threw up the tent while Doug started a fire, his face already red from the heat of it. We didn't talk much, just focused on getting things ready. It was nice to be away from the stress of driving, the constant clock ticking in our heads. For a while, it felt like we could relax. But then we heard it, a car engine sputtering, followed by the sudden screech of tires. It was a sound that didn't quite fit into the quiet of the mountains. I stood up and looked toward the road. It was odd to see anyone out here, especially a car. A couple was getting out of the car. The man was tall and thin, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans. His wife was shorter, with dark hair and a nervous look on her face. They walked toward us, waving their hands. The man's face was already red from the sun, and there was a wildness to his eyes, like he'd been on the road for way too long. "Hey, you guys got a minute?" the man called out, his voice carrying through the air. Our car broke down, and we could really use some help. Doug and I exchanged a glance. Normally, we wouldn't even think about getting involved with strangers out here, but we figured we were in the middle of nowhere, and they looked like they needed help. It wouldn't hurt to give it a try. We walked over to the car, a rusted-up sedan that was clearly older than it should be. The engine was hot, smoke still rising from the hood. Doug popped the hood and took a quick look. I stayed back, watching the couple closely. They both seemed a little on edge, their eyes darting around the place as if they were scanning the woods for something or someone. "Doesn't look like we can do much here," Doug muttered after a few minutes of poking around. "This car's done for." The man sighed, wiping his forehead. "Yeah, I thought so. I've been trying to get it fixed for months now. Just can't catch a break." Doug glanced at the woman. She hadn't said much so far, just stood by the car, looking uncomfortable. There was something off about the way she kept her distance from the woods, her eyes flicking nervously toward the trees, as if she was worried something might be lurking just beyond the tree line. "Can't you call someone?" I asked. "Too far out," the man said, shaking his head. "There's no tow service for miles." That was the first thing that struck me as odd. We were deep in the mountains, but there were a few towns nearby. The nearest tow company couldn't have been more than 50 miles away. Still, I didn't want to argue with the guy. It was clear they were in a tough spot. "Look, we're camping just up the road," I said. "If you want, you can stay with us for the night. We've got plenty of room, and I'm sure it'll be safer than waiting out here." The man hesitated, glancing at his wife, who seemed to give a small nod of approval. After a moment, he agreed. "Thanks. We'd really appreciate it." We led them back to our campsite, where Doug quickly set up a spare sleeping bag by the fire. We offered them some water and canned food. They didn't say much, just ate in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. I kept my eye on them too, but I couldn't quite figure out what was off about the whole situation. They were too quiet, too distant. As night fell, the sounds of the forest took over. The crackling of the fire was the loudest thing we could hear, but there was something else too. A feeling that the air was thicker here, like the trees were watching us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It had been a long drive after all. Doug went to bed early, falling asleep right away. I stayed by the fire, poking at the logs, trying to keep my mind busy. But the couple, especially the man, kept pacing around the campsite, his eyes darting from one corner of the woods to the next. That's when I started to notice the little things. The man and his wife seemed to know the area too well, like they'd been here before. They talked about the terrain as if they were locals, mentioning places by name that no one would have known unless they'd spent a lot of time here. I'd lived in the area for years, and I'd never heard of half the spots they brought up. Around midnight, I noticed something else, something that didn't add up. The man had told us his car had broken down, but when I looked over at the vehicle, I could see there was no sign of a tow truck anywhere. No tracks in the dirt, no sign of any help having come by. It didn't make sense. If the car had really been stranded for so long, someone would have come to take it away, right? But no one had. I walked over to the car, trying to figure out why it was still there. The couple wasn't paying attention to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were no fresh tire tracks in the dirt. The car hadn't been there long. It looked almost like it had been parked on the side of the road for a few hours at most. Then, just as I was about to return to the campfire, I saw something that froze me in place. A pair of headlights in the distance, slowly moving toward us. I stood there, frozen, watching the lights creep closer. It didn't take long to realize that they were not from a tow truck. The vehicle was moving way too slowly, and there was something off about the way the lights cut through the night. I turned around and quickly made my way back to the campsite. When I got there, the couple had already packed their things, as if they'd been waiting for something. I asked them if they were leaving, but they didn't answer, just kept glancing at the road, as if they were expecting someone or something. It was then that it hit me. They weren't stranded. They had never been stranded. Everything about their story was a lie. The car wasn't broken down. They weren't lost. They were waiting for something, waiting for whoever had been driving that car. I turned back toward the road, and in the distance, the headlights grew brighter. They were almost on top of us now. My heart started to race. Something wasn't right. I turned to Doug, shaking him awake. We had to get out of there. We grabbed our gear as quickly as we could, not daring to speak. The couple didn't move. They didn't even look at us as we packed up. We were just about to leave when the car pulled up to the campsite, the headlights finally blinding us. The door opened and a man stepped out. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something unsettling about his silhouette. The couple stood there silently, as if this was all part of the plan. They exchanged a glance with the man, and he nodded once. Doug and I didn't wait around to see what happened next. We got in the truck and took off, not bothering to look back. The last thing I saw was the strange man walking toward the campfire, his face still hidden in the shadows. By the time we made it back to the main road, I didn't feel safe until we were 100 miles away. Doug didn't say a word the whole time. I didn't either. Neither of us needed to. We both knew that what had happened out there wasn't just a coincidence. Those people weren't lost. They weren't in trouble. They were just waiting for something, and we were lucky we left when we did. After all, in the mountains, you don't just meet strangers who need help. Sometimes, the people who seem the most lost are the ones who've got something planned all along. The sun was setting behind the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest floor as Evan, unloaded our gear from the back of our truck. Beside me, my wife, Sarah, was unpacking the tent, a big smile on her face. This weekend was meant to be perfect, a break from our hectic lives, just the two of us in a quiet corner of the world. We'd chosen this spot for that very reason. It was a secluded area in a lesser-known national forest, deep in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, far away from the crowds. We had camped in other forests before, but this place felt different, felt untouched. We had been planning this trip for months. Sarah, a nature lover just like me, had always wanted to spend a quiet weekend in the wild, and this place seemed like the perfect retreat. There were no roads or trails leading through the area, just miles of thick forest and some old logging tracks that were barely used. We had picked it because we thought it would be peaceful, just us and nature, far from civilization. By the time we had the tent set up and a small campfire going, the sky had turned dark. The stars were so bright above us that it felt like we could reach up and touch them. The air was crisp, and the only sounds we could hear were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. It was exactly what we needed. We sat by the fire, talked, and ate a simple dinner of camp food, enjoying the peace and quiet. But something was off. At first, I thought it was just the isolation, the kind of feeling you get when you're far from any source of noise, the kind that makes every little sound feel bigger. But as the night wore on, I noticed that even the usual sounds of the forest were missing. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. It wasn't exactly silent, but it was still in a way that made my skin crawl. Sarah had noticed it too. "Isn't it strange how quiet it is tonight?" she said, her voice low as she stirred the fire. I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. "Maybe it's the altitude," I offered, trying to sound casual. "We're pretty far up here, so it could be the weather or something." She didn't say anything, but I could see she was still uneasy. We sat there for a while longer, the crackling fire our only companion, before finally crawling into our sleeping bags. Despite the stillness of the night, sleep came easily to both of us, but my dreams were filled with restless images. Faces in the dark, eyes watching us from the shadows. I woke up a few times, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving. The next morning, I woke up first, the gray light of dawn filtering through the trees. It was unusually cold, and I could see my breath in the air. Sarah was still sleeping, so I decided to get up and get the campfire going again. But as I stepped outside the tent, I was struck by the silence. The forest was unnervingly still. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, nothing, just quiet. I stood there for a moment, feeling like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off. Maybe the weather was changing, or maybe the forest was just in a rare, quiet moment. Either way, I didn't want to let it ruin our trip. I went about getting the fire going, but as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When Sarah woke up, we had a quick breakfast of granola and coffee before setting off for a short hike to explore the area. The air felt cold, and the quiet around us was heavier than before, but we tried to ignore it. After all, we were in the woods. It wasn't unusual for there to be moments of stillness. We wandered for a couple of hours, taking in the sights, the towering trees, the small streams, the moss-covered rocks. It was beautiful, and I could see Sarah's spirits lifting as we walked. But as we made our way back to the campsite, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, near the truck, were fresh tire tracks, wide and deep, leading off into the trees. The tracks weren't from our truck. We hadn't seen another vehicle on our way in, and there was no reason anyone else should be out here. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think someone else is out here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah's face was pale. "It doesn't look like it's been here long. Maybe they're nearby." I didn't say anything, but my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We went back to the camp and tried to push the thought out of our heads, but every time I looked at those tire tracks, I couldn't stop wondering who else could be out there and what they wanted. The rest of the day went by without incident, but the eerie quiet remained. We spent the evening around the campfire again, trying to make the best of things. But that night, as we lay in the tent, the unease was still there, gnawing at me. I lay awake, listening to the silence, straining to hear any sounds from the forest, but there was nothing, just an oppressive quiet that made my heart beat a little faster than usual. I don't know when I fell asleep, but the next morning was when things really started to get strange. The food we'd left out the night before was gone. Our bread, our fruit, the open jar of peanut butter, everything was missing. At first, I thought maybe an animal had gotten into it, but then I noticed something else. The camp was different. The chairs we'd left out were now positioned in odd places, facing away from the fire pit, and our backpacks had been moved. The zipper on one was open slightly, just enough to make me feel uneasy. Sarah noticed too. "Did you move the chairs?" she asked, her voice shaky. "No," I said, my voice tight. "I didn't move them." We stood there for a moment, both of us looking around the camp, the growing sense of dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't want to say it out loud, but the truth was clear. Someone had been here, someone who had been watching us, and now they were gone. We didn't talk much after that, but the silence between us was heavy. I thought about the tire tracks again, and the strange feeling that had been hanging over us since we first arrived. I looked over at Sarah, who was staring off into the trees, her face pale and tense. She didn't have to say anything. I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew we weren't alone. We decided to leave. There was no point in staying, not when every instinct in my body was telling me that something was wrong. But as we packed up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fresh set of tire tracks leading up to our campsite. The tracks were from a different vehicle this time. Smaller, more nimble, like someone had followed us in, keeping their distance, waiting for the right moment. I couldn't get the truck packed fast enough. My hands were shaking as I threw everything into the bed, and we rushed to get the tent down and the fire snuffed out. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed something else. There was a figure in the distance, standing just at the edge of the tree line. I couldn't make out their features, but I could see them watching us, waiting. I didn't say anything to Sarah, but I started the truck and drove off as fast as I could, not looking back. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hours away, and even then we stayed in the truck, too scared to go inside the diner. It wasn't until much later, after we had calmed down, that we realized something else. No one had been there when we had set up camp. We hadn't passed anyone on the road in, the last day, and yet someone had been out there watching us, following us. We never found out who it was, but that silence, that unnerving stillness of the forest, stayed with us long after we left. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, watching, waiting for us to return.